Welcome to Spotlight Matthew for today. I'm Tim Janisewski, the director of Spotlight Good News Ministries. Thank you so much for taking advantage of these devotional offerings that we give you, these devotional studies, so that hopefully you can dive deeply into the first gospel and grow your Christian life as you live to serve Jesus and learn to live to his glory. Today we come upon chapter 18. Now let me mention that we are in a segment of Matthew's Gospel from chapter 14 to 20 that has to do with the teaching of the 12. And what we meet in chapter 18 is an intensive block of teaching by Jesus to his 12 disciples, his training of them as he is preparing them for leadership in the early church after his death, resurrection, and ascension. And this block that captures the entirety of chapter 18 is the fourth block of concentrated teaching that Matthew presents to us from Jesus. What were the previous ones, just to review? Well, of course, the first one was the GOAT sermon, the greatest of all time sermons, the Sermon on the Mount, chapters 5, 6, and 7. The second block of teaching came in chapter 11. We called it Jesus' mini missions manual, where he prepared the disciples to go out with the mission and evangelism, the gospel of the kingdom to the people. The third block of teaching came in chapter 13, an entire chapter devoted to the parables of Jesus concerning the kingdom of heaven. And now in this fourth concentrated block of teaching, Jesus is going to speak about life in the new community. What is life to be like among his followers and his people as the 12 disciples, and then as the early church, and as we have continued to be the people of God in the church of God throughout the generations to our very time. And so we begin this teaching block, this teaching on the new community, with chapter 18, verse 1. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus and said, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" And calling to him a child, Jesus put him in the midst of them and said, "Truly I say to you, unless you turn and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven." That's chapter 18, verses 1 through 4. What Jesus does here, of course, is that he has brought the question, who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Questions about who's the greatest apparently went back all the way to the time of Jesus. We hear these questions all the time in our day. Who is the greatest pitcher in Major League Baseball history? Who's the greatest quarterback ever to have thrown passes in the National Football League? Who would be your greatest president of the United States ever? Who is the greatest intellect and the greatest inventor or creator in the world of history? What's the greatest invention and who invented the greatest invention? We love to talk about who is the greatest, don't we? I even think in my childhood of Muhammad Ali, who was back then Cassius Clay, who said of himself as a heavyweight boxer, "I am the greatest." And he was the greatest at that time and didn't mind telling people about that. Some people liked the swagger, others were put off, but indeed, he was the greatest at that time. And this is behind the question that the disciples are asking. They want to know who's going to be greatest, but greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Well, Jesus has already answered the question as to who is the least in the kingdom of heaven. Back in the Sermon on the Mount, he said, "Whoever does not keep the least of these commandments and teaches others not to keep these commandments of God will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven." And Jesus says even here that unless you become like a little child, you won't even enter the kingdom of heaven. So Jesus seems to be much more interested in being least and not so interested in what has to do with the greatest. And I think that's exemplified by the fact that he brings this little child into the midst of the group there. And he uses the child, if you will, as an object lesson. Perhaps you've gone to a church where the kids come forward and the pastor or the children's director pulls out some kind of an object and teaches a little spiritual lesson using that object. Well, Jesus is teaching a spiritual lesson, but he's using the child in the children's message as the object lesson itself. And he says to his disciples, unless you become humble, unless you become like this little child, you won't be entering the kingdom. But if you do humble yourself and become like this little child, you will be greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Why a child? Well, I think there's been a lot of fanciful speculation about this that reflects our culture. Instead of first century culture, we will say it's because children are so trusting, or children are so innocent, or children are so loving, etc., etc. And if we were just trusting, if we were innocent, if we were loving, then we would be following the way that Jesus is wishing us to go, as exemplified in this passage. But I think we're following the wrong trail there, because in first century culture, children were seen to be of little consequence. They weren't important. It's not that they wouldn't grow up to be important. They had the potential to be important. They might grow up to be the leader of the world. Who knows? Jesus was a child, and look what he grew up to be. But when they are children, they're not important. Children are not changing the world. Children are not the greatest. Children have yet to assert themselves with the markers of what makes for greatness in the eyes of people, because children haven't accomplished much of anything, and therefore they are never revered. Nobody ever looks at a little child and says, that child is just the greatest intellect ever. No one says about a little child, he's the greatest basketball player ever to live. No one says about a child, he's the greatest humanitarian or the greatest businessman, the greatest gatherer of finances, the richest person in the world. No, you can never say that about any child, because they haven't done anything. And they're humble in their low estate and low status as little children. And that's what Jesus is trying to drive through to his disciples. Don't even be looking for the markers of greatness when it comes to who you are in the kingdom of heaven, because those are of no consequence in the eyes of God. What is of consequence? Well, Jesus says that it is the way of service. It is the way of humility. We have seen Jesus say this already. The first of the Beatitudes. Blessed are those who mourn. That's the second Beatitude. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, the second. Blessed are the humble or the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Jesus starts, remember, way back the Beatitudes, with saying that step one, square one to kingdom character, is coming to a place of humility in our lives, and living in that humility so that we hunger for the right things, the righteousness of God. We hunger and thirst in the fourth Beatitude. Or, as James would teach in James chapter 3, humble yourself in the sight of the Lord, and he will lift you up. There you have it at nub. Jesus is saying, James is saying, the scriptures are saying that it is when we count ourselves of no consequence, or even if we are of great consequence, we're not about our consequences. It's then that we have the opportunity truly to be great in the kingdom of heaven, which is totally counterintuitive to the way of the world. Because Jesus says, indeed, those who are first will be last, and those who are last will be first. Those who are trying to be first, to be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, will end up to be the last and the least in the kingdom of heaven. And those who are not about even thinking of themselves as being first in the kingdom of heaven, and are glad to be the least in terms of their own self-assessment, those are the ones whom God will count to be the greatest and the first in his kingdom. So, we need to take that to heart, don't we? And it's a hard lesson to learn, because we live in a world that is bent on assessing who is the best, who is the greatest, who has the most markings and trappings of what counts for greatness. And in the kingdom of heaven, Jesus says, we're not into that, because Jesus himself was the greatest. But Jesus said of himself that he came not to be served. That's what the earthly greatest would do. He came not to be served like the great of the earth. Rather, he came to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. So if you want to be great in the kingdom of heaven, become like that child of no consequence and humble yourself and live as a servant of Jesus Christ that looks to praise him above all and to lift up his people to his glory, because that is true greatness in the eyes of Jesus. And this is Spotlight Good News. Thank you for joining us, and we will pick up our Lectio Continua, our ongoing study of the Gospel of Matthew, next time.